I never thought therapy would lead me here, talking about intimacy with my therapist, only to find out he wanted to be more than just my therapist. That's the kind of plot twist I wasn't expecting when I first walked into his office 6 months ago, looking for help because I'd spent my whole life dodging real connection. But here I am, trying to make sense of it all, because honestly I'm confused and maybe a little hopeful. So let me back up. My name's Alex, 28, living in a city that's big enough to feel anonymous, but small enough to run into the same people at the grocery store if you're unlucky. I've always been the guy who's confident in everything except relationships. Making friends? Easy. Career? On track. But getting close to someone, really close, emotionally or physically, that's where everything locks up. I figured therapy was the logical next step, like finally learning the rules to a game I'd been playing wrong. Enter Dr. Mason. When I first met him, it was your typical therapist setup. Warm office, shelves packed with psychology books, a couch that looked more comfortable than it was. He's in his early 40s, kind of the rugged professor vibe with salt and pepper hair and these sharp blue eyes that somehow made me feel safe but also kind of exposed. He listened without judgment, which was new for me. Most people never got past my jokes or awkward silences, but Mason saw through all that. He said I had a wall up, which, okay, no surprise. What wasn't obvious at first was how good he was at making me feel like I mattered. Not just as a patient, but like someone he genuinely wanted to understand. Our session started with the usual stuff. Family, past relationships, trust issues. But eventually, the topic no one else could get me to talk about came up. Intimacy. I wasn't just scared of it. I was frozen by it. Like my brain refused to let my heart in. One afternoon, after a particularly raw session, Mason said something that threw me off. He told me, "Alex, I think I can help you with intimacy, personally, not just professionally." I laughed nervously, assuming he meant a different kind of therapy, or maybe a workshop he was running. But no, he leaned in and said it again, softer this time, like he wasn't sure if I'd take it the wrong way. I sat there, heart pounding, wondering if I'd misheard or if this was some kind of ethical line being crossed. But the way he looked at me, earnest, a little vulnerable himself, made me realize this wasn't a joke. Mason was offering to help me outside the usual therapist-patient boundaries, something personal, something real. I told myself to stay professional. I told myself this was a bad idea. But part of me, the part that had spent so long shutting down, wanted to see where this could go. Because what if this was the chance to finally break free from the prison I'd built around myself? That's where things stood when I left his office that day, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Was I crazy for even considering it? Or was this the moment everything changed? I still don't have all the answers, but I know one thing. My life just got a lot more complicated, and maybe, just maybe, a lot more hopeful too. After I left Mason's office that day, I felt like my brain was caught in a storm. I walked the city streets slower than usual, trying to untangle the knot of emotions he'd just thrown at me. It wasn't just that my therapist had crossed some invisible line, it was that I actually wanted to see where it went. Which, yeah, sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. I spent the next few days overthinking every word from our session. I even caught myself replaying the moment when he said, "I think I can help you with intimacy, personally." The way his voice softened, the look in his eyes, it all stuck with me. It wasn't like the typical clinical detachment I'd expected. There was something genuine there, something daring. Still, I didn't know if I was just imagining things or if Mason was serious. So I made a decision. I'd bring it up again at our next session, but cautiously. I needed to understand what he really meant without crossing any lines I wasn't ready for. When I showed up at his office a week later, I was a bundle of nerves. Mason greeted me with that same calm smile, like nothing was unusual. But I could feel the tension between us before I even sat down. So I started, fiddling with my shirt sleeve, about what you said last time, about helping me personally with intimacy. What exactly did you mean? He paused, eyes searching mine, as if measuring how much I was ready to hear. Then he leaned back and said, "I want to be upfront because I value our trust. What I suggested isn't something I offer routinely. It's unconventional, but I've seen therapeutic progress happen when there's real connection beyond the standard setting. I'm talking about helping you experience intimacy safely and respectfully with someone who cares. That someone who cares part hit me hard. It wasn't just therapy jargon. It sounded like he was offering himself in some way as a kind of guide. It was thrilling, but also terrifying. I didn't know what to say. I mean, the idea of my therapist being that close to me, emotionally and maybe physically, felt like stepping off a cliff without a parachute. But I also knew that if I wanted to break down the walls I'd built, I couldn't stay safe forever. Okay, I finally said, voice shaky but honest. I want to try, but we need boundaries. Clear ones, because I don't want to mess this up or hurt anyone. Mason nodded, relieved, and we spent the rest of the session laying out what that help would look like. No pressure. No expectations, just a gradual process where I could explore intimacy in a space where I felt supported. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Our sessions began to shift. They felt less like therapy and more like connection. We talked more openly, laughed more, and sometimes the silences between us were comfortable instead of awkward. One evening, after a particularly honest session about my fears around touch and vulnerability, Mason suggested we meet outside the office, in a neutral, casual setting. I was hesitant, but curiosity won. We met at a small coffee shop near his office. He was waiting when I arrived, looking less like a therapist and more like a guy you'd see at a bar with friends. We talked about everything and nothing. Music, old movies, our weird family quirks. For the first time, I saw him as a person, not just my therapist. That night, when Mason walked me to my car, he reached out and brushed a stray hair from my forehead. It was a simple gesture, but it made my heart race. I looked up at him, and he smiled softly, like he was waiting for me to decide if I wanted more. I wanted more, but the next few days dragged with all the usual doubts. Was this ethical? Was I being naive? Was I risking losing the one person who'd helped me start to heal? I wrestled with those questions constantly. Then, one evening, I texted him something like, "Can we talk about what happened at the coffee shop? I'm confused." His reply came almost immediately. "I'm glad you messaged. This is new for both of us, so let's take it slow and figure it out together." That message felt like a lifeline. Our conversations grew deeper, more personal. Mason was patient, never pushing, always checking in on how I felt. He helped me explore my boundaries and fears, gently encouraging me to lean into vulnerability. And slowly, I started to feel things I'd buried for years: hope, trust, even desire. One night, after a particularly long session, Mason invited me to stay and talk a bit more. We sat on the couch, the room dim and quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside. I was nervous but ready to be brave. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "I'm here with you." I squeezed his hand, and in that moment, I realized I was starting to break free from the loneliness I'd carried for so long. But I also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Crossing the line from patient and therapist to something more was complicated, messy even. Still, I was ready to see where this unexpected journey would take us, because for the first time, intimacy didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a possibility. That night, as I sat there holding Mason's hand, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into something unknown but deeply wanted. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was charged, like we both knew we were crossing into new territory but weren't rushing it. I kept thinking about how strange it was that my therapist, the person I'd trusted to help me untangle my emotional mess, was now someone I wanted to hold close, in a way I never imagined. He shifted slightly, his eyes locking with mine. "Alex," he said softly, "we don't have to move faster than you're comfortable with. This is about you feeling safe, always safe." His voice calmed me in a way that nothing else had before. The vulnerability I'd been so scared to show was suddenly feeling less like a weakness and more like a hopeful step forward. "Thank you," I whispered, squeezing his hand back. We stayed like that for a while, just sitting close, the hum of the city a faint backdrop. Eventually, Mason stood up and stretched, breaking the spell. "I should probably let you get home," he said, smiling gently. I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and nerves. As I got up, I realized I didn't want the night to end. But I also knew I needed to process everything before jumping in head first. Walking to my car, I replayed the night in my head. I was terrified of risking the only person who'd started to pull me out of my shell, terrified of what crossing that line would mean. But, at the same time, it felt like a chance to rewrite my story, and I was ready for that. The next week, our sessions took on a new rhythm. We began to talk more about what intimacy really meant to me, not just physically, but emotionally. Mason helped me unpack years of fear, shame, and self-doubt. I started to see that my walls weren't just about avoiding pain. They were about protecting a part of me I didn't believe was worthy of love. One afternoon, Mason surprised me with an invitation to join him at a small art exhibit downtown. He said it was unrelated to therapy, just something he enjoyed and thought I might too. I accepted, seeing it as a chance to explore this new connection outside of his office. The gallery was bright and filled with local artists' work, some abstract, some painfully real. We wandered the rooms together, talking about colors and emotions, sharing stories that had nothing to do with my therapy sessions. It was refreshing, like meeting a friend rather than a patient. At one point, Mason stopped in front of a painting that looked like a chaotic swirl of blues and reds. "This one reminds me of you," he said quietly. I laughed, surprised. "Wait, you think I'm a messy whirlpool of conflicting feelings?" "Exactly," he smiled, but also beautiful, in a complicated way. There was something about that moment that made me feel seen, really seen, for the first time in a long time. I glanced over and caught Mason's eye. His expression was warm, encouraging. After the gallery, we grabbed coffee at a nearby cafe. The conversation flowed easily, and I found myself opening up about things I'd never told anyone, not even in therapy. I told him about my first heartbreak, my fears around being vulnerable, and the loneliness that had shadowed me for years. Mason listened without interrupting, nodding as if each word mattered. When I finished, he reached across the table and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "You're stronger than you think, Alex." That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something else. I was starting to develop feelings for Mason. Not just gratitude or trust, but something deeper. A feeling I'd buried for so long that I wasn't sure I remembered what it felt like. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I caught myself daydreaming about him, imagining what it would be like to let him in, not just as my therapist, but as someone who could be part of my life in a different way. But every time those thoughts crept in, a voice in my head reminded me of the risks, the ethics, the possible fallout. Still, Mason seemed to sense what I was feeling. Our conversations became more tender, more intimate. One evening, after a session that was heavier than usual, he asked me if I wanted to come to his place for a glass of wine. The invitation felt loaded with possibility, but also with caution. I hesitated, then said yes. His apartment was cozy, filled with books and soft lighting. We settled on the couch, the wine glass warm in my hands. For a while we talked about work, music, and trivial things. But underneath, there was this electric tension neither of us tried to deny. At one point, Mason reached out, brushing a lock of hair from my forehead, the same gesture he'd made weeks ago. My heart pounded. I looked at him, searching his eyes for a sign that this was okay. He leaned in slowly, giving me a chance to pull back. But I didn't. Our lips met softly, hesitantly at first, then with more certainty. It was like 1,000 emotions collided all at once: fear, relief, excitement. I knew this was complicated and maybe even risky, but in that moment, it felt right. Afterwards, we just sat together, our breaths mingling, the world outside fading away. I still don't know how this will all play out, but for the first time, I'm learning that intimacy isn't just about physical closeness. It's about trust, courage, and the willingness to be seen, even when it scares you most. And with Mason, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm ready to take that leap. The days after that night at Mason's place were complicated, to say the least. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, balancing between the euphoria of what we shared and the pounding questions in my head about what it all meant. Was this just a momentary escape, A dangerous blur in the lines between therapy and something more? Or the start of something real? I honestly didn't know. When I saw Mason again for our scheduled session later that week, I could tell he was feeling the weight of it too. His usual easy confidence was tempered by a sort of cautious tenderness, like he was tiptoeing around the obvious but unspoken. We sat across from each other, the familiar setup suddenly charged with new tension. I cleared my throat, nervous. So I said, about us, I guess this changes things. He nodded slowly. It does, and that's okay. But we need to be really clear about what this means, for both of us, and for your progress. I appreciated that. Mason wasn't trying to sweep it under the rug or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, he was willing to confront the messiness head-on. I don't want to lose what we've built, I admitted. You've helped me more than anyone ever has, but now I'm scared. Scared this could all fall apart, or that I'm just chasing something I don't really understand. Mason leaned forward. It's normal to feel that way. What matters is communication. Boundaries will shift, and we'll have to navigate that together. But I want you to be honest with me every step of the way. That honesty, being able to say the things I'd spent years keeping bottled up, felt like a breakthrough in itself. Over the next few weeks, our relationship slowly settled into a new rhythm. We kept up with therapy sessions, but they felt lighter, more collaborative. Outside the office, we saw each other less often, but every time we did, there was an unspoken understanding that things were different now. One Saturday afternoon, Mason invited me to a small picnic in a nearby park. He promised no therapy talk, just a chance to enjoy the sunshine and maybe share some of the things that made him tick. I was hesitant but curious enough to say yes. The park was quiet, dotted with people lounging on blankets and kids chasing after frisbees. Mason spread out a blanket under a big oak tree, unpacking a basket with wine, cheese, and some homemade bread. We settled in, the casual setting making me relax, in a way the office never did. Mason talked about his childhood in a small town, his love for hiking, and the weird obsession he had with 80s movies. I found myself laughing more than I had in ages. For the first time, I wasn't just a patient or a guy wrestling with intimacy. I was a friend, maybe even something more. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the park, our conversation grew quieter, more personal. I told him about my fears around being vulnerable, how I sometimes felt like I was trapped behind a glass wall no one could break through. Mason listened, then said something that stuck with me. Walls don't just keep people out, they keep you in. Sometimes, the hardest part is letting yourself out. That day, I realized Mason wasn't just helping me with intimacy, he was teaching me how to live it. But of course, life has a way of testing the best laid plans. About a week later, I got an unexpected message from my oldest friend, Chris. We hadn't talked much recently, mostly because I had been hiding this whole therapy thing, even from him. The text was casual, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. Hey man, wanna grab a beer? We need to catch up. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How do I explain this new chapter to Chris? How much do I share about Mason? Would he get it? Would he judge me? I texted back, yeah, sounds good. Let's do Friday. Friday night came faster than I expected. I met Chris at our usual dive bar, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and no one asks too many questions. We slipped into the familiar rhythm of beers and banter. Eventually, the conversation turned toward relationships, the usual what's new stuff. I hesitated, but decided to be honest, at least in part. I've been seeing a therapist, I said, and it's gone from just therapy to something more complicated. Chris raised an eyebrow. Complicated how? I took a deep breath. He's kind of helping me with intimacy personally, like beyond sessions. We're exploring a relationship. Chris stared at me for a beat, then grinned. Dude, that's wild. But if he's good for you, then hell yeah, just don't lose your head. His casual acceptance surprised me. It was the first time I'd felt like I could say it out loud, without fear of judgment. The relief was huge, but also terrifying, because saying it out loud made it real. After that night, I started thinking about the future with Mason in a way I never had before. What did this mean long term? Could something that started in the therapist's office become a real relationship? Mason and I hadn't talked about that yet. And honestly, I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Then, a few days later, he surprised me again. After a session, he asked, "Have you thought about what you want from this, us?" I blinked, caught off guard. "I guess I'm still figuring that out." He nodded. "Me too. I don't want to rush, but I also don't want to ignore what's growing between us." That honesty made me feel less alone. Maybe we were both scared, but maybe that was okay. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me I hadn't expected. "Yeah, let's keep figuring it out. Together." For once, I wasn't scared of what might come next. Because with Mason, I felt like I had a chance, not just at intimacy, but at something real. After I said, "Let's keep figuring it out," together, there was a kind of quiet understanding between Mason and me that felt both fragile and thrilling. It was as if we'd crossed some invisible threshold, acknowledging that what we were building wasn't just a blip or a mistake. It was real, messy, and maybe worth the risk. That night, I walked home with a strange mix of excitement and anxiety buzzing in my chest. It felt like I was standing on unfamiliar ground, the kind you step onto knowing it could either sink beneath your feet or become the foundation you've been looking for. The next few days were a blend of hope and hesitation. We kept our sessions professional, but there was a softness in Mason's gaze that hadn't been there before. Outside the office, our messages became more frequent, casual check-ins that slowly edged into conversations about everything: books, music, fears, dreams. One evening, Mason asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. Nothing fancy, he said, just him cooking something simple. I agreed, a little nervous but eager. When I arrived at his apartment, the place smelled like garlic and something else warm and inviting. Mason was in the kitchen, humming softly as he chopped vegetables. He looked up, surprised but happy to see me. "Hey," he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Glad you made it." We settled at the small dining table, plates filled with roasted veggies and pasta. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. At one point, Mason reached across the table and brushed a crumb off my cheek. The gesture was small but intimate, and it made my heart skip. "Alex," he said quietly, "I know this is complicated, what we're doing, but I want you to know I'm here for the long haul, however that looks." I looked down for a moment, feeling vulnerable but safe. Me too. After dinner, we moved to the couch, the city lights twinkling through the window. Mason put on some music. A playlist of songs he said reminded him of early summer nights. We sat close, shoulders touching. He looked at me then, eyes searching mine. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Where do you see yourself in, say, a year?" With us, I took a deep breath. "Honestly, I don't know, but I want to find out. I want to see if I can trust someone enough to really let them in." Mason smiled softly. "That's all I want too." In the weeks that followed, we kept walking that fine line between therapist and partner. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush us. Boundaries blurred, and sometimes I questioned if I was doing the right thing. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, I found myself overwhelmed by the swirling emotions. I told Mason I needed a break, some space to think. He agreed without hesitation, reminding me that my feelings mattered most. During that pause, I realized how much I'd come to depend on him, not just as a guide through my struggles, but as someone who made me feel seen and wanted. And that scared me, scared enough to pull back, unsure if I was ready to fully surrender. But Mason was patient. He gave me the space I needed, checking in just enough to remind me he was there. When I was ready, we picked up where we left off, this time with clearer boundaries and mutual respect. One night, Mason surprised me with tickets to a small theater show, an indie play he'd been raving about. It felt like a date, but without the pressure of labeling it one. We sat side by side in the dim auditorium, our hands brushing occasionally. After the last scene, when the lights came up, Mason squeezed my hand and I felt a rush of warmth flood through me. Walking back to his apartment under the stars, I realized how much I wanted this, to keep exploring, learning, and maybe loving. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. A week later, Mason's office called with news I wasn't prepared for. There had been a complaint. Someone had noticed our growing closeness and reported it. Suddenly, the reality of our situation crashed down with brutal force. I sat in Mason's office, the usual comfort replaced by tension. He looked tired but determined. "This could cost me my license," he said, voice low. "But I don't regret what we've shared." I wanted to be brave, to say the same, but fear clawed at me. The thought of losing him, of never fully stepping into this connection we'd built, was unbearable. "I'm here," I said, reaching for his hand. "Whatever happens, I'm here." We made a plan to be as careful and honest as possible, to protect both ourselves and the work we'd done. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt shadowed by uncertainty, but through it all, Mason and I held on to each other, to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, love could find a way even in the most unexpected places. And as I sit here now, writing this, I realize that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most meaningful destinations. With Mason, I'm learning what it means to risk everything for the chance to truly be seen and to finally be loved. After the complaint, things did get complicated, no doubt about it. Mason had to take a leave of absence while the professional review played out. Those weeks felt like a strange limbo. Our connection paused, but the feelings didn't just disappear. If anything, the distance made it clearer how much we'd come to mean to each other. During that time, we stayed in touch cautiously. No therapy sessions, no pressure, just honest conversations and check-ins. It was awkward at first, like figuring out how to be us without the structure we'd relied on. But slowly, the walls between us softened in a new way. Without the therapist-patient dynamic, we were just two people trying to navigate something fragile and new. When Mason finally got the green light to return to practice, under certain conditions that meant he couldn't see me as a patient anymore, it felt like a relief wrapped in a challenge. We both knew the transition wouldn't be simple, but for the first time, there was a clear path forward. We made a choice. Mason would help me find a new therapist for my ongoing support, and we'd explore what us looked like without the therapist label hanging over everything. That wasn't just a formality. It was a boundary we needed to honor so that what we had could grow in the right way. I remember the day Mason dropped by my place, not for a session, just a visit. It was the first time we saw each other purely as partners, outside any professional roles. He brought coffee and that easy smile that had once felt so out of reach. We sat on my couch, talking about everything and nothing. At one point, Mason reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle and familiar. "I'm proud of how far you've come," he said quietly. "Not just in therapy, but with us." I felt a warmth well up inside me. "I'm proud of us too. It's been scary, but worth it." He smiled, and without overthinking, I leaned in. Our lips met, not as therapist and patient, but as two people who'd built something real from the most unexpected place. Looking back, I realized that the real breakthrough wasn't just about learning to be intimate. It was about learning to trust. Trust myself, trust another person, and trust that love can be messy, imperfect, and still beautiful. Now, our relationship isn't perfect. We have tough conversations and moments of doubt. But those moments don't scare me the way they used to. Because with Mason, I've learned that vulnerability isn't a weakness. It's the doorway to connection. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all, that sometimes when you take the risk to let someone in, you don't just find intimacy, you find yourself.